Chapter 7 With the Indians Through the Jungle. From Andre's dwelling, a mule track led us another half-day's journey further into the tropical forest, to the colocao of the two Brazilians. The bigger of the wretched huts served as living and sleeping quarters. Under a soot-blackened shelter, the newcomers quickly kindled a fire. Here the mules had to turn back. The track came to an end, and the sad moment arrived for me to load my baggage on to the backs of the Indians. Kwarume tried to make it clear to me that I should so divide up the things that no one got too much to carry. With his help, I set to work. The bundles were tied round with a strip of bast, the end of which finished in a loop. This loop the Indians placed round their foreheads, so that the main weight was taken by the neck muscles. Every bundle was, I suppose, picked up and tested at least 20 times to see whether it might not be too heavy for the long journey. None of the men had more than 8 or 9 kilograms to carry, most of them far less, and yet they pulled faces as if they were being condemned to the galleys. If they had had their way, the radio set would have been cut into 2 or 3 parts, so that it did not weigh too heavily on the head. The sun had already passed the zenith when we finally set off. "Goodbye, and the best of luck," I said, giving a farewell handshake to the 2 rubber gatherers and the muleteer. "Adios, doutor, boa viagem." Goodbye, doctor, and a good journey. These last representatives of civilization called after me, and then I was alone with the naked Indians. At first we followed a tidily and broadly hewn-out estrada of the rubber gatherers, which led from one rubber tree to the next. The bark of these trees bore deep, V-shaped incisions. The remains of the whitish milk from last year still adhered to them. Here and there on the ground lay rusty tin cups, in which the liquid rubber is caught during the fabrico. Then we pushed into the jungle along a path which was scarcely visible. With an elation not unmixed with anxiety, I became aware that I was entering a new world. For the first time in my life, I was really and truly going into strange parts, nor did I know whether and when I would return. 1,000 questions pressed in upon me as I stumbled over tree stumps, festoons of creepers, and hidden stones. To be sure, the TUPARI will receive me kindly at first, I told myself, but what sort of a face will they make when they realize that I am not coming on just a short visit, but intend staying with them for months? Will it be possible to go on as far as the distant Kwaru? And is there any truth in that story that the Indians force a welcome guest to take a wife and to never let him go again? How, I wondered, would a solitary white man fare during a wild carousal? And how much can one believe of the rumor that at home the TUPARI are enthusiastic cannibals and murderers? But what need of bloodthirsty murderers and cannibals? What would happen to me if some insidious fever laid me low, or if I got appendicitis, or even a mere ridiculous toothache. And the loneliness. Ahead of me lay months, I don't know how many, which I was to spend utterly alone with the naked Indians. True, I had already filled several pages of my notebook with the words of their strange language, but there was still a long way to go before I could make myself fully understood. And can a man who is not cut out by nature to be a hermit live for months without sight or sound of his own race? In the loneliness might I not fall victim to the cafard? How many a white man, at one moment apparently well and happy, has not the next hanged himself from a tree or put a bullet through his head in a sudden fit of tropical delirium? I thought of a young Spaniard who had once been one of my nearest neighbors in the Bolivian Cinchona forest. He managed a settlement there. He was very seldom alone. Almost every day he was visited by his workpeople and passing muleteers, and yet the solitude preyed upon him. The jungle, with its gloom and its thousand uncanny sounds, began to frighten him. Visions of wild animals and lurking enemies tortured him day and night. Then he tried to run away from the jungle and return to the nearest village, barely 3 days' journey away, but he could no longer. Find his way out of the forest. One day he cut his throat with a kitchen knife, and while bleeding to death, hanged himself from a beam in his hut. Such were my thoughts as I hurried on, following the man in front, up hill, down hill, through wooded plains, down into little ravines, and then up once more. After some 2 hours we reached a stream. I sat down and pulled off my shoes and socks in order to wade across. Now, aquí dormir, no sleep here, explained Indians, sitting beside their packs on the damp forest floor. I should have thought that we could have covered another stretch, but one thing was plain, it was not I who gave the orders here. We put up the hammocks with the jungle for our bedroom. It will not rain, Kurumi, the chief's son, assured me. I had no tent, and to build a hut for protection would not have been worth while. Above us arced the thick, leafy canopy of the forest. Only here and there the blue sky peeped through. If it should nevertheless rain, then one simply rolled one's hammock up and sheltered under a tree until the storm had passed. My companions gathered brushwood and dry sticks, and a small fire was soon flickering beside every hammock. From my stomach a feeling of weakness began to spread over my whole body. I was hungry. "Shall we cook something?" I asked Kurumi, and pointed to my aluminum pot. The young Indian looked at me in astonishment. "Cook something?" he asked. "But we haven't anything to cook." He was right. We had nothing from which to prepare supper. I had limited my baggage to the barest essentials and brought with me only a minute emergency ration. I had argued that where 20 Indians found something to eat, I should not go hungry either. Nor in fact did I starve on this journey, but now and again my stomach rumbled. "Where is the farinha?" asked Kurumi. He wanted to mix up a chibe with farinha and sugar. I nibbled at the dry maize seeds and banana slices from my small provision bag. A young Indian cracked me a few Brazil nuts with his strong teeth. Slowly it grew dark. I wrapped myself in my blankets. The night was fresh and held promise for a heavy dew. The two TUPARI beside me turned in their hammocks and made up the fire which lit up their naked bodies. Soldado Neon, one of the young fellows, asked and looked searchingly over towards me. I did not understand him, but made a careful mental note of his question. It was not until much later that I grasped what was exercising my little neighbor. He was asking whether I was a soldier. The TUPARI had heard some grim tales about the military in Saint-Louis. In their eyes, soldiers and police were a tribe of wild men, with no other thought in their heads but robbery, violence, and murder. When I awoke next morning, my companions were already astir. They were crouching down close to their little fires, waiting until the corn cobs, which they had laid on the fire, were cooked. "Oka Kiora, come along, let's go. Vito hedged tuge." The Maloka of Vito is a long way yet. In single file we followed the overgrown forest path. I kept in the middle of the procession, never go in front and never bring up the rear. One of the rubber gatherers had warned me. He knew he knew very well why. He himself had once got lost in the forest, and had wandered round in the bush for 3 days, and spent 3 nights up in the branches of the trees, trembling with anxiety, hunger, and cold. Then he finally found a hunting track, and dragged himself back to his hut exhausted. Suddenly 2 shots rang out. "Macaco preto," the man behind me explained. "Black monkeys." Kurumi and Yubei had gone on ahead with the shotguns. They had learned how to handle them in Saint-Louis. At the next halt they showed us their bag. Each had brought down a black monkey. "E Mueller, they are women," said Kurumi. "The TUPARI have only one word for woman and female animal." My companions sat down by the edge of the path. 2 of the boys gathered dry palm leaves and suspended the dead monkeys at full length from a sapling bent horizontal. Underneath they made a pile of dried leaves and lit them. The fire blazed up and singed the animal's long black hair. But then, and a shiver ran down my spine, a pitiful crying and squeaking came from the smoke. The Indians laughed and looked with amusement into the flames. A tiny monkey was crawling round the scorched body of its mother, desperately seeking help in its deadly peril. But the mother hung silent and motionless over the flames. In the heat her face was contorted into a ghastly grimace. Then the young monkey ceased its cries. It still clung to its mother as if seeking protection, but now no longer stirred. The smoke and heat had finally suffocated it. The boys pulled the monkeys down, slit open their bellies, and removed the entrails. They did not wash the guts, but merely removed the waste matter and then packed them into large leaves. Next, they bound the animals' legs and tails behind their necks, forcibly bent back their arms, which were stretched stiffly out in front of them, tied them to their chest, and made a loop to carry the bundle. "Here, take this," said Kurumi briefly, and handed me his monkey. His baggage was heavily weighted with things which he had scrounged in Saint-Louis, whereas I was carrying only a small sack with a few provisions, so I hoisted the monkey onto my back, passed the loop over my head and round my forehead, and set off. About once an hour the Indians stopped and rested on a strip of land, which was not overgrown with jungle vegetation. We picked off one another the ticks, which had bitten themselves a firm hold all over our bodies. Occasionally one of our number would ask for the bush knife in order to remove a thorn from the sole of his foot. Others managed with the point of a bamboo arrow, or with a long-shafted rodent's tooth. Poshe, they groaned, and placed both hands on their heads, which had to bear the weight of their load. The Indians had not yet discovered that it is far easier to carry a load when it is hung over the shoulders with two loops like a rucksack. On we went through the forest. The path zigzagged up and downhill. Now and again we crossed small streams. If I could not reach the far bank by leaping from stone to stone, I took off my shoes and socks in order to wade across. My companions always waited politely on the other bank until I was once more dressed, ready to continue the journey. Early in the afternoon, the path widened out. We passed small patches where fires had once been lit and grids. It was not long before the wood opened out into a clearing. Before us rose a large round hut. "This is Tomas Antonio's Maloca," said Kurumi. Tomas Antonio was the chief of the first group of Yabuti Indians, the self-same sorcerer who had once tried to poison the missionary bishop of Guajara in order to save having to give him a gift in exchange for the rifle. A pack of small yellowish-white dogs rushed up to us and barked angrily, but not a soul appeared. The Maloca seemed utterly deserted. Only a few chickens added their clucking to the chorus of barks. We went in through the low door, which was half blocked by palm leaves. At first I could not make out anything in the windowless room. Slowly my eyes grew accustomed to the half-light. In the middle of the hut was a screen of plaited palm leaves, which masked part of the room. In front of this stood a row of huge clay containers with their pointed ends driven into the earth. Along the vaulted side of the roof the hammocks of the inmates were hung up. Small fires were glowing and cast their light on three naked Indian women, who stared at us curiously. Tomas Antonio said a TUPARI, pointing to the other side. There, in a hammock, lay a motionless human form. I had already learnt from Andre that Tomas Antonio was very ill, so I went over to him and wished him boa tarde, and asked him how he was. "Como vai?" But instead of answering, the sick man only groaned. His hand lay cold and bony in mine. I prepared to sit down. Just in the nick of time, one of the Indian women pulled from under me her earthenware cooking pot, which, in the semi-darkness, I had taken for a block of wood, and pushed forward a low stool for me. Tomas Antonio had doubtless made the acquaintance of white people decades before, and I thought he would speak fluent Portuguese, but I was mistaken. In a language which I did not understand, probably Yabuti or Makurap, but with signs I could not fail to interpret. He described his pains. Suddenly he sat up in his hammock with a groan. "A qui doctor?" he asked. Was I a doctor? He raised his legs, which had wasted away to skin and bone, from the hammock and stretched them towards me. With a brusque gesture he bade me try my healing arts. At Andre's I had been present at the magic ritual of a medicine man, and I knew full well what the old man wanted of me. I was to carry out the same hocus-pocus on him, puffing and blowing and spitting, flinging my arms about, and perhaps even sucking at his belly. But I felt little inclination to do this. Besides, I was by no means clear in my mind about the nature and cause of his illness. He seemed to be aches and pains from head to foot. At all events, a few aspirins and atabarin tablets can't do any harm, I thought, and took them from my baggage, which the Indians had meanwhile piled together at the entrance to the hut. The sick man was not satisfied. None the less, with an irritable expression, he took the tablets. Ahmad, he said, he would swallow them tomorrow. That was as might be. But in these pills, which he despised, he none the less saw a proof of my goodwill. At his bidding, one of the naked women brought me a plate of cooked yucca and 2 oranges. Towards evening the other members of the household returned from hunting and work in the fields. One young man spoke broken but comprehensible Portuguese. I worked in Saint-Louis for a long time, he told me proudly, but the free mode of life in the Molucca had evidently pleased him better than the supervised work in the Baracao. In all, there must have been about 10 families living in the hut. I distributed some tobacco, cigarette papers, and matches among the men. They seemed delighted. Indeed, my generosity seemed to surprise these people and quickly won me friends. One of the old women, who had in the meantime slipped on a red dress, put her arm affectionately round my neck, gave me a friendly dig in the ribs, and gabbled away at me. "What is she saying?" I asked one of the young men. "You are to stay here and not go to the TUPARI," he laughed. "She says you'll be eaten by the jaguars there." In the meantime the TUPARI had collected yucca and yam tubers from a nearby field, and had their game cooked. "Toto, eat monkey," they urged me. The monkeys, along with their scorched skin and the remains of singed hairs, had joined the tubers in the stew pot, and did not look over appetizing, but it was evening by now, and could no longer distinguish very cleverly what one's fingers were holding, and besides, I was hungry. We spread our hammocks. I had not unpacked the mosquito net since Saint-Louis. Those nocturnal pests had remained far behind on the Rio Branco. There were no mosquitoes in the interior. There were just the little piums and borrachudos to bite during the daytime, but one was left in peace at night. I was just dropping off to sleep when I was suddenly startled into wakefulness by a hissing behind me. The pot-bellied old Tajuru, one of my traveling companions, revealed himself as a sorcerer. In front of him, in the light of a gently flickering fire, squatted an ancient, wizened Indian woman whom I had not noticed during the day. With her head bowed in resignation, she stared unmoving at the ground. Her brown breast hung sadly down over her lean ribs. like empty, wrinkled leather bags. She was groaning fit to melt the heart of a stone. Tajuru squatted on his heels. With massive deliberation, his hands stroked his patient's body, moved about in the air, and then seemed to draw something from out of his own limbs, which was then charmed into the woman. At last he bent over the motionless form of the patient, and sucked noisily at her neck. Still crouching, he shuffled to the door, and spat out what he had sucked from her body. This proceeding lasted for at least half an hour, the old woman moaning and groaning the while. For a long time I could not sleep. My neck had grown stiff from the unaccustomed monkey carrying and was hurting me. At regular intervals the sick chief coughed. The old woman groaned loudly and continuously. At last she vomited and quieted down. Quiet. Early next morning my people were preparing to set off. A Yabuti brought everyone a bowl of chicha. I chewed away at a tender corn cob, which Tomas Antonio sent to me by the hand of his sister. Yubei, who carried my shotgun, slipped half an arm of monkey into my hand. He had saved it for my lunch. I did not notice any of the Indians take leave of the sick chief who was their host, and only now did it strike me that also, on the previous day, no TUPARI had greeted the master of the house. Sick men, however great their standing, seemed not to exist for visitors. Could it be that those who were well were afraid of the evil being who brings diseases? Once again we went on through the bush, uphill, downhill. A giant jungle tree had been so skillfully felled across a broad stream that its top reached the other bank. We balanced our way across. Only a few elderly Indians preferred to wade through the fairly fast current up to their chest. As they did so, they held their bundles firmly on their heads with both hands. It was about midday when the column suddenly stopped. A naked Indian came towards us, bow and arrow in hand, and a bush knife tucked under his arm. He uttered a wild cry. "That is Maracuti," whispered the man in front of me. An animated conversation began. Maracuti was chief of the next Maloka. We should come too. Doubtless we were already near his hunting grounds, and the proud tones in which he spoke showed that he was quite conscious of the fact. But the TUPARI respected the authority of the master of these woods, through which they were passing as guests and strangers, and gave only gentle and deferential answers to his haughty words. I had hoped to spend the night in Maracuti's hut, but we did not manage this. Near a small stream we spread our hammocks from tree to tree. The weather was glorious and held no threat of rain. One of the hunters bagged a sapaju monkey. We had hunted nothing all day. One small monkey to feed 25 mouths. Again we mixed up 2 pots of chibe from water, farina, and sugar. In addition, we cracked some Brazil nuts, of which my companions seemed to carry inexhaustible supplies in their baskets. We had already turned in for the night. Then beside me there started up again the puffing and hissing, which I now knew so well. I turned in my hammock. Who, I wondered, was old Tajiru's new patient? It was Tajiru himself, patient and doctor in one. His feet were painful from the long day's trek. There was evidently not another medicine man within the group. so what else could he do but carry out the magic incantations over his own poor limbs? Next day the fatigue became general. The rest on the way became more frequent. Everyone complained of the long journey, the numerous thorns, painful feet, calves, and backs, and the heavy loads for which, heaven knows, I bore very little responsibility. Soon after midday we reached a small ground-nut plantation. My companions flung their packs to the ground, and fell upon these low plants as if they were starving. They quickly uprooted them, and broke open the nuts. Those which were not ripe they crammed into their mouths, without wiping off the earth which adhered to them. Rather dubiously, I too tried some of these raw ground nuts, which I had hitherto eaten only roasted. They tasted quite good, but I could not quite understand the enthusiasm of my companions. Only in the course of the months which followed did I see how important ground nuts are to these Indians, and how miserable they feel if they have to go without them for a time. A few hundred yards on, we came upon Marakuti's Maloka. It was much smaller than Tomas Antonio's abode, but was of the same design, round and with a domed roof. We found no one in the hut. Only after a time did an elderly man and a boy appear, whom I had already met in Saint-Louis. There they had gone about in shirt and trousers. Here they once more contented themselves with a leaf over the penis, and a string of small beads about their middle. The old man removed the covering from a chicha mortar, stirred the contents with a long-handled ladle, and filled each of us a huge bowl of fresh maize chicha. The TUPARI waited for their portion in reverential silence, without giving the slightest sign of their thirst or their burning eagerness. It was midday, and the sun beat down on the small clearing outside the hut. We rested a little longer. Why go on till one was out of breath? At last the cry was, "Oka, let us go." "Oka, Vego," said one of the lads to me with a grin. "Oka, Vego," I nodded. That meant, "Let's go home," and it caused the TUPARI no end of amusement that I should describe their distant Maloka as my home. After a short trek, more small plantations appeared, and finally we reached a round hut. It must have held about 2 or 3 families. The master of the house was called Tukamif. He and his family belonged to the Yabuti tribe. We were not expected. All the inhabitants were naked, but now one young man searched hastily for his trousers and shirt. A tall, lean girl placidly went on turning the heavy grinding pestle for the chicha, without turning to look at us. It was still early in the day, and we had only recently had a good rest at Marakuti's, but the sight of the girl making chicha was enough to make my party resolve not to go a step further. The TUPARI were already unrolling their hammocks and suspending them under the small square shelter which stood in front of Tukumil's hut. But the young man in shirt and trousers seemed to be of another opinion. He went from one to another and pointed out to the TUPARI that there was any amount of chicha, yucca, maize, and tapir meat at his neighbor Taba's. He, on the other hand, had nothing to eat or drink. It was understandable that in this little hut they were not particularly pleased about our visit, for where in the world can more than 20 uninvited guests suddenly appear in a small community of 2 or 3 families and demand free entertainment with food and drink? But the prayers and entreaties of the young man made no impression on my companions. They stretched out in their hammocks, turned their backs on their host, and showed him plainly that they were not in the least convinced by his mean explanations. If a strange Indian visited the TUPARI, he was given generous amounts to eat and drink, and now they, the TUPARI, were on their travels again, after some years, and they expected the same hospitality. They would not let themselves be turned away, but in the end they thought better of it. They must have seen the hopelessness of the situation, rolled up their hammocks again, and hoisted their bundles on their backs. The young man, highly delighted, ran on ahead and took us to where Tababa lived. Several children playing in front of the square hut ran off screaming. Dogs barked and circled round us at a cautious distance. Out through the door came an old man of small stature, with a wizened, good-natured face, a gnome or dwarf straight from the pages of our fairy tales. The only difference was that he was naked and had no beard. We exchanged greetings. 2 or 3 more Indians came up and shook hands with me, and we then went into the hut. A few women sat on the ground, cooking or spinning. They did not deign so much as to look at us, but I was already accustomed to that. The young man from Tukamimi's hut had told no more than the truth. Tababa's chicha jars were brimful, as if a great banquet were imminent, and on the grid the meat of a giant tapir was grilling. We had come just at the right moment. I should much like to have made friends with the master of the house, but our conversation was wretchedly inadequate. With every day that passed we were getting further from civilization, and scraps of Portuguese were becoming rare. "Yabuti no prego," muttered the Tupari contemptuously. "How ugly this Yabuti language is!" Only Kwarume seemed familiar with the idiom of these neighbors, and he chatted busily away with Tababa. Every word, or half of every sentence, which Tababa said, he said rapidly after him. I hardly believe that he understood every word of what the old man was telling him, but it is in this way that Indians probably learn the different languages of their neighbors. First, they imitate the word without understanding its meaning, practice the pronunciation, and grow used to its outlandish sound. Then they gradually learn what single words and sentences mean, and so they slowly master the foreign language without grammar or dictionary, just as we do our mother tongue when children. It was days since we had been able to eat our fill as well as we did on that evening at Tababa's. For the most part we had set out without breakfast, or had tried in vain to appease our rumbling stomachs with dried maize and a few Brazil nuts. Today, when we slung our hammocks, some in the hut, and whoever could find no more room there in the nearby forest. We were replete and content. Even on the following day, Tababa's hospitality was not yet exhausted. His men distributed to my companions whole bundles of freshly cut arrows and a quantity of bamboo. "Isn't there any bamboo like this near your Maloka?" I asked. "Well, there is," replied Kurumi, "but the bamboo here is thick and hard. Where we are it grows thinner and is no use for large arrows." Now I also understood why old Valte had been dragging a long piece of red wood with him all the way from Salouy. "Throw it away in the forest," I had once told him when we were on the march. "Throw it away? Are you mad?" his astonished face had said. Obviously wood for a good bow was not to be found at every turn. On we went. My pack had been made heavier by roasted maize, boiled yucca, the roast heart of the tapir, large and small pieces of fish, and a huge pawpaw, all presents from our host, old Tababa. We had frequent rest, and revelled in the rich provisions which, as it is well known, can more easily be carried in the stomach than on the back. About midday we reached the Maloka of the Irakapu Indians. There was not a soul to be seen. Across the small clearing roamed a few dogs and chickens, and a large parrot was perched on a post, lazily sunning his gay plumage. We did not wait about for long in the oppressive sunshine, but went in. But there was only an old woman, with withered breast and a morose expression, squatting in the dimly lit room. She was placing piece upon piece of brownish clay on to the wobbling edges of a new chicha jar, which threatened to collapse at any moment. My companions took off their packs and asked the potter a few questions. She answered in unfriendly fashion, and scarcely looked up from her work. "There's no one at home. The chief, Ahi, has gone off hunting for a few days." We waited and waited. No one came to offer us chicha or any other refreshment. My companions grew more and more solemn and silent. Then something happened, which gave me a brusque reminder that I had left civilization and civilized customs far behind, and was in a world where other habits ruled and men were moved by other modes of thought. The chief, Kwarume, got up, bow and arrow in hand. Nothing in his wild expression recalled his accustomed good-humored grin. With solemn faces, his fellow tribesmen squatted and crouched round the entrance to the hut. Kwarume turned his back on them and launched out on an angry address into the semi-darkness of the hut. He spoke in TUPARI that I could well gather, but exactly what he was saying and the gist of his angry speech I could not understand. "Wape, wape," was the only word I caught, and which he repeated time and time again. "Chicha, chicha." He spoke long and violently, then a deathly hush prevailed. Kurumi was sitting beside me. "What is your father saying? Why is he angry?" "He is not angry. The Irakapu are angry with us. They have made us no chicha." From the darkness of the hut 2 men emerged and sat down with us as if nothing had happened. They conversed with the TUPARI in low tones. One of them vanished again and returned with a gourd full of thick chicha, but it worked out at only a small sip for each of the thirsty travelers. A young woman roasted some ground nuts and corn cobs in all haste. That was all. We had not bagged anything during the day, either. The malokas of the Yabuti were too close together, and the game on both sides of the path which linked them had been scared away. The mood was hardly one of sweetness and light, so it was not hard for us to take our leave next morning. The sun was not yet visible, but on the edge of the forest it lit up, with a gorgeous pink, a tree-top, which was studded with blossom. There stood my TUPARI ready to set off. The Arikapu had probably had pangs of conscience for having shown such wretched hospitality, and presented them with a bundle of arrows. We covered a short stretch of the way, and then came upon traces of burned-down huts. Moreu, died, explained Kwarume in broken Portuguese. Many Arikapu had suddenly died here. The survivors had left the place and burned down the huts. At midday we crossed a fair-sized stream. From both banks huge trees had been felled across it, and poles of creepers had been bound from branch to branch, but the improvised handrail had already half rotted away. Rio Branco, explained the Indians. That must be the upper course of the river on which weeks before I had rowed up to Salouie. The path grew worse than ever. Often my companions seemed to lose their direction for a time, but on we went tirelessly through the bush, frequently on all fours. My shirt hung in shreds about me, and blood was dripping from my back, though admittedly not my own blood. The hunters had been lucky and brought down 5 monkeys on the way. One of them they had once more loaded onto me. It was not until late that evening that we called a halt, spread the hammocks between the trees, and kindled a fire. Half a monkey went into my pot, the shining aluminum of which the TUPARI gazed at, and touched again and again with delight. The remainder was placed later on grids, lashed together in great haste from green stakes and lianas. Irid no kego, we shall be home the day after tomorrow, I said experimentally in my newly learnt TUPARI. No, answered my neighbor, not the day after tomorrow, we shall be home tomorrow. And he pointed with his hand to half the western sky. When the sun is there tomorrow, then we shall reach Vito's Maloka. And the closer we drew to the huts of their home, the less did the Indians seem to notice fatigue and painful feet. Scarcely was day dawning than we rolled up our hammocks, did up our bundles, and marched off. Again and again we passed abandoned plantations and burnt-down malokas. The bush was simply impassable. We had to crawl on all fours. Moreu, died, Kwarume would occasionally lament with a sad face. But this was no time to indulge in long meditations. The Indians ran as if the law were at their heels. Only occasionally did they pause and consider in which direction we should go. From the burned-out huts and deserted plantations, the old hunting paths led in all directions. They were crossed by overgrown tracks. At one moment we would be going east, the next south. Finally we followed a path which grew broader and better beaten. It must have been about 4 o'clock when we stepped out on to a broad clearing planted with innumerable heavy-laden papaw trees. It could not now be very much further to the TUPARI Maloca. My companions squatted down beside a stream and began to wash. They called on me to do the same and passed round my comb and pocket mirror. They seemed to set great store by arriving home neat and trim. Anyone who has read the descriptions of imaginative travelers probably conceives such a trek through the jungle to be far more adventurous. One thinks above all of the bush as being full of poisonous snakes and other monsters, hissing, shooting out tongues from all sides, and only waiting for a chance to fall viciously upon the innocent traveler. But in fact, on this last day of our journey, we saw our first snake. We had sat down for a brief rest. Then suddenly I heard a shout. The fat kurumi leapt up as if electrified. A second man who was squatted beside him on a rotting tree trunk flung his feet in the air, and others jumped clear. A snake about 1.5 yards long wriggled between our legs with lightning speed. Animals worth hunting had also been encountered surprisingly seldom. The few monkeys we had bagged were the sole contribution to our keep. True, we saw everywhere the tracks of tapirs, agoutis, pacas, wild boar, and armadillos, and once we even heard the wild barking of a chajasu. But unfortunately it had vanished into the bush before one of the marksmen could send a bullet or an arrow after it. We had repeatedly discovered jaguar tracks, particularly by the small watercourses, but the 6 bullets which I had was holding in readiness for this dangerous beast of prey in the chambers of my revolver were still undischarged. Only a few more 100 yards we plodded on along a broad path. Then Yubei fired 2 shots from my shotgun, and a few cocks crowed in answer. In the jungle, that is the unmistakable and comforting sign that a human habitation is at hand. The wood opened out into a broad clearing, and there in the center rose the domed roofs of 2 huge huts. This was the home of the TUPARI. Chapter 8. The TUPARI's Welcome. Whenever an expedition comes upon an Indian tribe or unexpectedly enters a village of savages, there ensues a confusion, as if one had disturbed an ant-hill or a hornet's nest. The men seize bows and arrows and rush outside the huts, ready to give battle. The women and children raise shouts of fright and flee in terror into the darkest corners of their huts or take refuge in the nearby bush. But if the approach of the strangers is noticed in good time, then the frightened natives snatch up all their goods and chattels, flee into the bush, and leave only the smoking domestic fires as a sign of their precipitate exodus. For how can one know what designs the strangers are harboring? Why are they invading this solitude? What else can have brought them here but the desire to murder and pillage? There was no sign of any such confusion when our party reached the TUPARI Maloca. My companions had probably been eagerly awaited for a long time, and they took me, a strange visitor, into the bargain. The men who had returned home 3 weeks earlier must have told them that I was a harmless enough fellow from whom they had nothing to fear, but who was, on the contrary, bringing many desirable gifts. I paused irresolutely outside the huts. In which of the two should I install myself? Karume, the chief of the smaller, I knew far better than the solemn Vito, who had left us so impatiently in Salui. I should get on well with Karume, that was certain. Moreover, I had his son Kurumi close at hand, there. True, he was behaving in his usual cross-grained manner, but perhaps he would finally agree to act as interpreter if I was in difficulties with my few scraps of TUPARI and sign language. Meanwhile, my companions did not fuss unduly about the question of where my quarters should be. They led me into Vito's large hut, put down my baggage on the ground by the entrance, and made themselves scarce without saying a word. There I now stood. Naked Indians emerged from the dark background of the hut and vanished again. Women and children cast surreptitious sideward glances at me, without fear and without visible curiosity, and I almost felt something approaching disappointment that I caused no sort of stir in this company. Vito's hut was considerably bigger than the huts of the Yabuti and the Arikapu, in which we had stayed en route. Even after my eyes had grown used to the semi-darkness, I could hardly see as far as the back wall, although there were no intermediate walls of any kind to restrict my view. The circular, roughly hemispherical, arced space reminded me of a circus tent. In the middle stood a post, which vanished up into the darkness of the vaulting overhead. Slender rafters cut from very thin, untrimmed trees, and with the lower ends buried in the ground, ran from all sides to the vertex of the dome-shaped roof and joined the tip of the central post. At an appropriate height, horizontal subsidiary beams, made to conform with the curve of the roofing, were attached, and resting on several posts rammed obliquely into the ground, kept this strange vaulting in the desired hemispherical shape. Higher still, where these supporting devices no longer reached, the thin rafters had, to be sure, given way beneath the weight of the covering of palm leaves. At two places the dome had fallen in, and so the hut presented a badly battered appearance, and at first glance one might think it ready to collapse. Everywhere small crannies let the sun's rays penetrate the roof, and to begin with, it was a mystery to me how such a home could stand throughout the rainy season and keep its inmates dry. But I felt no desire to busy myself just at the moment with questions of Indian architecture. I was hungry and thirsty, and about 20 huge chicha jars, which stood in a wide circle round the central post, held my gaze spellbound. Where could Vito be? I was wondering whether I ought perhaps to take a chance and look for him in the gloom of this huge hut. Then an old Indian came up to me. He grinned at me with twinkling eyes and placed his arm affectionately round my neck. "Esta neon?" he asked. Later I learned that this is the usual form of greeting. "Esta neon?" The TUPARI asks a guest, "Have you come?" And the answer must be "Otsa on." Yes, I've come. "Poare?" It is well. The other then replies, and friendly conversation can then begin. But as I have said, I found this out only later. Hitherto the Indians had always greeted me by offering me their hands, and to my regret had always been at pains to imitate the manners of the whites when dealing with me. "Where is Vito?" I asked the old man. "Pexi pa quinino," he answered, "little fishes," and he pointed into the forest. So the chief had gone fishing. I left the old man and went over into the other hut, but I could not discover any of my traveling companions. They must have withdrawn into the depths of the hut and taken to their hammocks. Immediately beside the door a young woman put down her baby and came up to me. Although I am no giant, she came only up to my chest, but she looked completely unabashed and obviously was not in the least concerned about her nakedness. She shook hands, and it seemed as if she smiled archly at me. Then she turned away again, took her baby from the hammock and put it to her breast. No one seemed to pay any attention to me, and I went out into the clearing. One Indian had sat down on a small stool and was working away at an arrow. He looked up, and I nearly started back in alarm. A coarse, scarred face with squint eyes, the whole framed in a shock of hair. If the rumors of the man-eating magician were correct, then this must be his executioner. Such was the thought which flashed through my mind, but I held out my hand to him politely, and greeted him, boitard, in the hurried manner of people unused to shaking hands. He grasped my hand without saying a word, and then became absorbed in his task again. Feeling somewhat uneasy, I returned to Vito's house. Here 2 Indians were awaiting me. They brought me food on earthenware plates, half friendly, half suspicious. A boy set down an artistically carved stool in front of me. I sat down and tucked into the boiled tubers and juicy roast meat. It was probably agouti paca hare. While I chewed away in leisurely fashion, I let my gaze wander through the hut. I should very much have liked to go deeper into the semi-darkness, to see at close quarters what the Indians, their wives, and children were doing, but I did not wish to upset them by tactless curiosity. The TUPARI lay in their hammocks, which were hung along the side of the roof to the rafters and supporting posts. A few women crouched beside their fires, raveling out cotton or spinning. How many people lived in this house, I wondered. A total of 40 families had survived from the tribe, I had been told. Since the adjoining hut was considerably smaller, there must be some 30 families here, that is, more than 100 souls. Yet there was no crush or confusion. Everyone obviously knew where he belonged. No one got in anyone else's way. The whole central portion of the hut seemed completely unoccupied. Round the wide circle of chicha jars ran a broad gangway, and only from this did narrower lanes radiate to the sleeping quarters of the Indians, which were ranged along the curved wall. I had finished my meal, The two TUPARI took back their bowls with a broad grin, and I ventured through the hut to a small side door, which gave on to the edge of the forest. The backyard was dotted with singular chicken houses, round and pointed at the top. On the right was an open shed scarcely 1/4 covered, and to the left a broad path led into the forest. A few Indian women suddenly appeared, bearing full water jars on their bare shoulders. They gave me a quick glance, and then stepped past me into the hut. Then the chief arrived as well. With firm stride he came stamping up the path. In his left hand he held bow and arrows. His bush knife he carried tucked under his right arm, and on his back there dangled by a loop of bast a fairly large moqueca. In there were presumably the pexi paquinino, the little fishes which he had caught in a nearby stream. Boitard he called when he was still some distance off. He seemed to be really pleased about my arrival. Boitard, he laughed, gripping and vigorously shaking my hand. He had already noticed that white men do not shake hands limply. Delighted at this friendly reception, I tried to start a conversation, but Vito had vanished again. In some surprise, I followed him into the hut. There I saw the worthy chief making haste to slip into a pair of trousers. With some difficulty he buttoned them up. Now for the shirt. In his haste he missed the sleeve holes and thrashed around for some little time in this unaccustomed garment until it was at last properly on. With some embarrassment he smoothed out the khaki and glanced across at me. He did not like having cut so awkward a figure in my presence, but he had not yet completed his toilet. From some recess in the vaulting of the roof he pulled out an old felt hat and perched it on his long black hair. This was doubtless the hat which the hospitable mass murderer Andre had already told me he had given to Vito when the latter was on his way home. Vito seemed to have a very definite idea of what as chief he owed to himself and his guest. He had visited white folk often enough to know that greetings are not exchanged when one is naked. Now, dressed in shirt and trousers, and with the old felt hat on his head, he greeted me a second time. Boitard, he said in friendly greeting, and slapped me on the back, just as he had seen it done in St. Louis. I hastened to respond to his greeting, but I probably did not put on the friendly face which the chief had been expecting, for despite this double welcome I was beginning to become annoyed. Why were these free jungle Indians at such pains to imitate the behavior of the white interlopers? Or would he one day regard me as one of his own people, and act towards me as he was accustomed to do in his own world? Vito took energetic charge of me. In the main passageway, a few steps from the entrance to the hut, we slung my hammock and put the baggage near it on a base of long wooden stakes and pieces of bark. Then Vito sent for my traveling companions and told them to unpack what they had carried in their baskets for me on the long journey. Indians often like to wait and see if a white man remembers all his possessions. If he says nothing to his bearer, then the latter looks after the things until the stranger asks for them back, and doubtless in so doing he cherishes the hope that in the course of time the white man will forget this and that. But the chief was anxious to avoid the least trace of suspicion that in his Maloka anything could possibly be stolen from me by his people. Now my hammock was swinging below the big store shelf which ran round the sides of the roof at a height of about 7 feet, like a broad gallery, and I knew where my home would be for the weeks which followed. I no longer needed to look about me to find my neighbors. From all sides they came up to me without hesitation, and brought me things to eat. Little fishes about the size of sardines, a piece of agouti hare, mashed beans of violet hue, yucca tubers, bananas, pawpaws, and even a few steamed larvae. The sun was declining towards the edge of the forest. Slowly the little clearing which stretched between the 2 big circular huts and a few small provision stores and chicken houses livened up. Bows and arrows were piled in pyramids, so that the square soon looked like a small military camp. The men brought out their stools, women dragged up earthenware jars and bowls, and sat down with their children beside their husbands. An Indian politely offered me his carved stool, and Vito, the chief, still in his shirt, trousers, and hat, told me to sit beside him. I spread out on the ground the good things which had been brought to me, and fell to heartily. All around, the Indians were chewing and chatting. Now and again one would get up to offer his neighbor some of his own tidbits. Dogs, fowls, and even a few ducks milled about among those eating and tried to snap up a morsel. Only when twilight descended on the settlement did the Indians get up. The men reached for their stools and bows and arrows. The women took their vessels and the children. Everyone vanished into the hut. Night fell. Over the forest edge the moon slowly rose. The Indians lay in their hammocks and made up their small fires which diffused a faint light. I went out into the clearing. Strange how moonlight can transform a scene. Like huge whitish haystacks, the 2 huts stood out against the dark wall of a nearby forest. Towards the west the prospect was somewhat more open. A broad band of thick bushes adjoined the little clearing, and it was some distance before the giants of the jungle reared their branches to the sky like gesticulating arms. There, in the west, 100 or so miles away, lived the nearest whites. And what about the other points of the compass? Were there really wild tribes still living there who knew nothing of Europeans? Would it be possible to push forward as far as them and make new, unheard-of discoveries? In the pale moonlight, an Indian came up to me. It was Kurumi. "You have eaten very little," he joked. "You won't ever get a fat belly like that." He was silent for a while. "Let us hear some music," he then suddenly ordered, and pointed into the hut where my baggage lay. I brought out the radio set and assembled it on the clearing. And now the silence of the jungle night was interrupted by the strange voices and melodies of distant civilization, and from the Indians' huts they simply streamed forth. Young and old swarmed on to the moonlit square and clustered round the magic box, listened, stroked the black case, tapped it, felt it, tried to peer through the slats, and then assailed me with a flood of questions. Kadere no pe huved, apo na pe hodana, kire ne hare apo ipodaka. I beg your pardon, no, I'm sorry, I don't understand, but I can well imagine what you would like to know, and perhaps later on I can even explain to you where the voices come from. Late, very late, did weariness overcome the intent audience. I put the set back into the bag and crept into my hammock. Outside the hut a man was making, with a wealth of pathos, a ponderous speech. I held my breath, did not stir, and tried to listen, but I could understand only 2 words, Aramira and Udoka. These meant woman and tobacco. What could this nocturnal orator be so angry about? He called out vehemently several times about women and tobacco. Finally he concluded with a 3-fold solemn Mincy, mincy, mincy. Then silence reigned once more. For a long time I could not get to sleep. I listened to the chirping of the countless crickets and the noise made by the jungle animals. Bats flitted like ghosts through the hut. On all sides could be heard the myriad gnawings and bitings of hungry carabids, and there seemed to be legions of mice in this Moloka, squeaking and rustling back and forth. Now and then an Indian turned in his hammock, bent down to the dying embers, stirred up the flames by vigorous blowing, and composed himself to slumber once again. At last I too fell asleep.